Hi, everyone. Thanks, Julie. I'm thrilled to be back with you and with our prophet today, who I will be continually probably going back and forth between the English pronunciation, which is Hosea, and how we pronounce it in Hebrew, Hosea. So, same prophet, slightly different pronunciation. Also, for those of you who are worried about the source sheet, you should actually have all of the sources. They were all there by this morning. So it should be what you printed out if you printed it out this morning. Um, and if you were wondering why not Amos or Amos and why Hosea or Hosea today, well, it could have actually been either one because we don't actually have there's debate about who comes first. um, Amos is chronologically first in some views, and yet Hosea is the first prophet that we read in the section that's known as variously the Trei Asar, Shnem Asar, or in English, the minor prophets, right? We've gone now through the major prophets who have much longer prophecies: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, right? And now we're starting with prophets who are in English only, called minor prophets, right? They're not minor in the sense that they're less important. They're just grouped together, these 12, because they have shorter prophecies than the previous prophets. In some ways, we're going to see that Hosea actually might be, certainly as important and influential a prophet as any of those that we have studied thus far. So the Trei Asar, which is 12, that's what 12 is in Aramaic, sometimes called the Trei Asar, or the 12 prophets, lead off with Hosea. The canonization, by the way, of this whole 12 prophets or minor prophets as an anthology occurred relatively early in the Second Temple period, before the Hasmonean dynasty, before the Maccabees. And it's already attested to in the book of Ben Sirach, right? These 12 prophets being grouped together. And so we'll find out when we learn Amos or Amos in 2 weeks' time that Amos actually came before, chronologically, before Hosea. But according to the Rambam, your first source, you can see, and I'm not going to screen share this because I'm only doing it for context. We're not going to actually be looking at the text. Last time when we talked about Jeremiah 2 weeks ago, we talked about Jeremiah receiving the prophets, receiving Torah from Zechariah and passing it on to Baruch ben Neriah, Baruch the son of Neriah. So I thought it'd be interesting to look a little bit above in that same text. Well, where's Hosea in that chain? So Hosea is considered the first prophet here. Hosea received it from Zechariah, right? Who I think you'll be learning next week. And then Amos or Amos received it from Hosea. Okay, so according to the Rambam, Hosea taught Amos. And who did Amos teach? Isaiah. But chronologically, just so you know, scholars have a lot of different ideas about who was actually first or second, but a lot of these were at the same time, more or less. They were living through the same period. And the Minor Prophets as a book spans an era of about 300 years from the decline of the northern kingdom of Samaria through the earliest years of the Second Temple. And Hosea is usually put, for those of you who like a date, between the years of 786 to 721 before the Common Era. And your second text is from the Babylonian Talmud, and it is playing the same game of trying to place, well, who was when exactly? And it's doing it from the second verse in Hosea, which we're going to look at more carefully in a minute, but it begins when the Lord began to speak to Hosea. Or in Hebrew, it is Techilat diber Adonai Behoshea. Techilat diber, which is kind of a strange way of expressing this idea. In the beginning, when God spoke to Hosea, what beginning? What are we talking about, right? And so that's what the Babylonian Talmud is coming to teach. And again, I'm just going to read it because we're not going to be looking at it as a text right now. Based on this verse, the wording of this verse, the Babylonian Talmud teaches, was Hosea the first prophet? That it should be written when God spoke first to Hosea, right? There were other prophets before Hosea. Why start this way? But surely between Moses and Hosea, there were several prophets, right? Rabbi Yochanan answers, Hosea was first among the 4 prophets who prophesied at that time. And who are the 4 contemporary prophets, the 4 prophets who were prophesying at the same time? Hosea, Isaiah, Amos, and Micah. So when you think back to our learning, for those of you who were here with Rabbi Bernstein for Isaiah and Deutero-Isaiah, we can think of Isaiah and Hosea as contemporaries. And Hosea, we're going to see, according to scholars, his prophecy and the images that we use in Hosea that he brought actually influence some of the later prophets like Jeremiah and even his contemporaries, Isaiah. Often, this is from Saul Sadka. He said, he's almost the first prophet whose words were collected and written down. Read him as such. If some prophetic idea sounds familiar, there's a chance that it was Hosea who said it first. So a lot of the things that we're going to be seeing that might sound like prophetic conventions by now in the 6th, meeting of this series, actually were started and originated with Hosea. And we're going to see that today. Now, comparing Hosea and Jeremiah, who I was taught 2 weeks ago, Hosea served the role for Israel, the northern kingdom, that Jeremiah would later serve for Judah. Like Jeremiah, Hosea is portrayed as a doomsayer, right? The prophet of doom and gloom, the Jeremiad. But also like Jeremiah, the underlying message is one of hope amid the foreboding, right? And so again, with Hosea, we're going to be seeing a lot of rebuke and a lot of warning about destruction coming. Unlike Jeremiah, this is for the northern kingdom, which is not only still extant, but at the beginning of Hosea's prophecies is doing great. They're just fine. They're not under siege. And so his task is that much harder. The people aren't looking around thinking, ugh, things are really bad. They're thinking, why are you saying all of this stuff? We don't see it. We don't want to hear it. Things are just fine here. And there hasn't been a collapse of the Northern Kingdom, right? There isn't that same sense of threat. And so you can see that Hosea's job in some ways is going to be even more difficult, or definitely as difficult as Jeremiah. Now, with Jeremiah, we focused mostly in our learning on the imagery that Jeremiah brings. That's what distinguishes each prophet, right? Because in many ways, they're all giving a similar message of, turn back to God, right? And rebuke. But how does Hosea communicate these ideas? Not so that they're intellectual ideas, but so that people feel them and are moved by them and want to change their behavior because of them. What are the messages in this book through its imagery? How does this prophet get the message across, even in a time of prosperity and security? So the first thing to say about the structure of Hosea is that scholars divide the book into two sections. The first section is the section which is studied and discussed by far the most. It is chapters 1 through 3, and we're going to spend a good amount of time in those chapters. Chapters 4 through 14, similar to Isaiah, are sometimes called Deutero-Hosea or Deutero-Hosea, and are seen to be different, even though both sections contain rebuke and a call for tshuva. In the first 3 chapters, we're going to see that there is an extreme focus on one kind of metaphor or analogy or image, and that is of a relationship between a woman and a man. Hosea is the man, and we'll see who the women are, whether it's one woman or more than one woman. And we'll have a lot to talk about. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, though, I just want to begin with the first verse, which is, as we've seen before with the prophets, a contextualizing verse. So we'll just stay with the context for a little bit longer. I'm going to share my screen while we look at the first, let's see, actually, it's going to take me 1 second. There we go. I'm going to share my screen so we can look at the first verse for those of you who are following along. Okay, let me just make it larger. Great. All right. So you can see at the top of the screen, there's a lovely stone relief engraving of Hosea, and who we're about to meet in the beginning of chapter 1, his wife Gomer. But in the very first verse, it's just Hosea. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri. And I just want to look at the names for a minute. Hosea is actually a name that we see several times in the Torah. And it is always, largely, if not exclusively, used with members of the tribe of Ephraim. Joshua, the prophet, right, and the general and the leader of Israel after Moses, you might remember before his name was changed to Joshua, Yehoshua, and there was a yud added to the front of his name. Originally, his name was Hosea or Hosea. As we also have an Ephraimite chief under King David in 2 Chronicles, the verses chapter 27, verse 20, if you're interested, and the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel in 1 Kings 15:30 is also Hosea. Also, one thing in the second half of the book, chapters 4 through 14, Hosea regularly refers to the whole kingdom by the name of Ephraim instead of Israel. And the only place names that are mentioned in the book, names like Gilgal or Beit El or Mitzpah or Tabor, all of these belong to the northern kingdom. And we don't hear about Jerusalem at all. Therefore, scholars believe, this is according to Moshe Sokolow, a professor at Yeshiva University, that this prophet lived among the northern tribes and likely was an Ephraimite himself. And about his father, Be'eri, we don't know anything else except we have a midrash from Vayikra Rabbah that says every prophet whose father's name is mentioned was a prophet and a son of a prophet. So according to this midrash, we could understand that Hosea's dad, Be'eri, was also a prophet. And of course, just looking at the names themselves, Hosea, of course, means save or salvation, right? And Be'eri means my well, right? So salvation from my well is his name, this prophet. So the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Be'eri, in the days of Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel. So 4 kings. These are also the same 4 kings whose name begin the headings of the book of Isaiah, Amos, and Micah. So we know that they are contemporary. However, the inclusion here of Jeroboam ben Joash, king of Israel, which is not in the other books, strengthens Hosea's presumed northern origins, as it does for Amos, because it's also in Amos. Okay, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. Are there any questions just for this beginning? If not, I'm going to just continue to barrel through. Okay, I don't see anything yet. So if you do have a question, just hang on, and we're going to learn a little bit more first. So I want to read to you the second verse. When the Lord began to speak to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take you a wife of whoring and children of whoring, for the land has surely whored away from the Lord," which is a fun little rhyme in English, right? Unexpected, right? But you can notice in this verse that there is a clear preponderance of one word, whoring, right? This is nunim or zanut, which is also seen as prostitution or licentiousness. And God is saying, take a wife who variously understood among different commentators, a wife who is either an actual prostitute, a cult prostitute, a sacred prostitute, right? Or is not a professional, but is just a woman of very loose morals and behavior. And God is saying to the prophet, I want you to go find a prostitute or a loose woman, again, their language. And, for those of you who don't know what Hosea is about, there's There's a lot of feminist criticism of this book, right? We don't know much about this woman and how she feels about any of this. That is not the focus of the book. And we can talk more about that later. But this prophet is being ordered by God to marry a woman who otherwise would not be seen to be appropriate as a marriage partner for him. And Elie Wiesel, in discussing this, says it's a perplexing, if not a disturbing task. Why is this the task for Hosea? Why is God ordering Hosea to do this? And he even goes farther to say, can you imagine, from Hosea's perspective, receiving this prophecy? Go take you a wife of whoring. Wiesel, may his memory be a blessing, wonders, where does he know to find one? Right? Does he go around asking, excuse me, do you know a prostitute I could find? Or, can you point me in the direction of a woman who's known to have really licentious behavior? Right? Who does he ask? I mean, maybe he knows, but there's a perplexing and disturbing command here. This is not God saying to Jeremiah, even buy a piece of land, which was perplexing, but marry someone whose behavior is highly problematic, and have children from this union who you won't be certain are yours. And why? Because the land has surely whored away from God. Notice the focus of the land here and not the people, right? Something has been corrupted already. And notice, this is Robert Alter's wonderful translation. Whored away from the Lord. There's a sense of dislocation and distancing, that something that was close and should be intimate has been disrupted and distanced. Verse 3, the prophet follows the order, and he went into Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for soon I will make a reckoning for the blood of Jezreel against the house of Jehu, and put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall be on that day I shall break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So he's saying, call him Jezreel, because Jezreel is going to be destroyed. Just not how we would normally want to name our children, in the name of destruction. But we don't stop there. Verse 6, and she conceived, Gomer conceives again, and bears a daughter this time. And God says to Hosea, call her name Lo Ruchama, which in Hebrew means I will not be merciful. I will not show mercy. And then explains, for I will not more show mercy to the house of Israel, nor will I forgive them in any way. These children are the embodiments of this prophecy. But to the house of Judah I will show mercy and rescue them through the Lord their God, but I will not rescue them through bow and sword and in battle with horses and with horsemen. Meaning, this land is going to be conquered, but there is some kind of mercy I will eventually show. But then in verse 8, and she weaned Lo Ruchama, and conceived and bore a second son. And God said, call his name Lo Ami. This is not my people, not my nation, and I will not be yours. Perplexing, disturbing. God is asking Jeremiah to marry this woman, Gomer. They have 3 children, and each child is not named out of hope and joy and optimism or a connection to the generations, but these children are named as the embodiments of prophecies of destruction. So, of course, one question that all the commentators ask is, what is this? Is this a metaphor? Is this really happening? Did Hosea really marry this woman? Are these children really walking around with these names? What's going on here? And we're going to go deeper into these questions, but this isn't the end of the story. So I want to actually look a little bit more at this, but I'm going to take a minute before we go on just to, I'm not going to be able to do all of the questions in the chat. So we're going to look, I'll see if there's anything. Okay, and there's a question, is Hosea not defending Gomer, just being obedient to God? He's not supposed to defend her, but we will see right now that he's going to deliver a furious rebuke to her. Again, she is, in the same way that their children are embodying the prophecy of destruction, she is embodying the idol worship of the people Israel, right? Which at the time is significant, is Baal worship, right? I'll put Baal, the Canaanite god, right? Okay. And yes, Michael says, just like Hosea could not leave his own children, God will not leave his wandering children. We're going to see that, but we're not there yet. You know, there's always the desire when we get to these prophets who have such stinging and uncomfortable rebukes, we want to go right to the comfort, to the Nechama, right? But I will say, you know, it was true for Jeremiah, and it's also true for Hosea. There's more rebuke than there is comfort, although the comfort is so significant and beautiful. All right, let's look at a little bit of the rebuke. And I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to tell you that I'm reading to you from chapter 2, but I'm actually reading a different translation. I'm going to read to you from the Alter translation instead of the Sepharia translation that I gave you, which is an older JPS translation. And I think it's actually a great exercise to look at the differences and listen to the differences between translations, because it gives you a feel for the activity of the translator and the interpretation that is present in the translation. So looking at the top of chapter 2, and the number of the Israelites shall be like the sand of the sea, that cannot be measured and cannot be counted. Actually, I realized I just started at verse 12. So I'm going to do that because we have so much to get through, and I'm going to have to keep a good look at the time. Okay, sorry about that. I'm going to move forward to chapter 2, verse 12. This is the rebuke. And the rebuke begins earlier, but here we are at verse 12. And now I will lay bare her shame before the eyes of her lovers, and no man shall save her. And I will put an end to her rejoicing, to her festivals, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her appointed times. and I will wither her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, they are a whore's pay for me, that my lovers gave to me. I'm just going to interrupt my own reading just to note how the woman and the land are being constantly woven together here. That it is supposedly the woman he is speaking to, and yet so many of the images actually turn to the land, and they're seemingly the same thing. And I will turn them into scrubland, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will make a reckoning against her for the days of the Baalim, to whom she burned incense. And she put on her nose ring and her jewelry and went after her lovers. But me she forgot, said the Lord. Therefore, I am about to beguile her and will lead her to the wilderness and speak to her very heart. And I will give her from there her vineyards, in the valley of Achor, an opening to hope. And she shall sing out there as in the days of her youth, as on the day she came up from the land of Egypt. And it shall be on that day, said the Lord, she shall call me Ishi, my husband, and no longer call me Baali, a different word for husband that uses the word Baal, the same word as this god, Canaanite god. She's going to call me my husband, Ishi, instead of my Lord or my Canaanite god, Baal. And I will take away the names of the Baalim from your mouth, and they shall no more be recalled by their name. And it goes on in beautiful language, but we can see just in those short verses, 12 through 20, like the move from God's disgust and anger. And also in that verse 15, she would go after her lovers, forgetting me, right? Like the plaintive note of God feeling betrayed and maybe even lonely, left behind. And once God feels that, once God goes and names the fact that God feels forgotten, somehow that is the moment that God says, but it's not forever. And we're going to be back together. And actually, it's going to be even better when we reunite, because I won't be Baali to you. I will be your man, right? Something that has no sense of ownership and has more sense of cooperation and both sides, almost equality, right? And if that's not enough for us, just a few verses down, we have some of the most famous verses of the Torah, beautiful verses of the Torah that many of us recognize as verses said in the morning when putting on the tefillin, when wrapping the tefillin, an embodied act on the body, right? This is verses 21 and 22. I'm just going to read them in the Hebrew, and then I'll read them in the English. Ve'erastichli le'olam, ve'erastichli betzedek u'mishpat u'vechesed u'v'rachamim, ve'erastichli be'emunah v'yadat et Hashem. And you might have heard in the Hebrew that one word is repeated over and over, ve'erastichli, and I will betroth you. I will betroth you to me. And in the English, and I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in right and in justice and in kindness and in mercy. And I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you shall know that I am God. Okay, this is a lot. The one thing I want to say, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. The one thing that I want to say about all of this is, actually, I want to say a few things. One, we're still holding on to the question of how metaphorical or analogous this is, or whether this is actually happening. And we're going to go into that shortly, but not quite yet. We're still remembering that we really don't know anything from Gomer's point of view here, right? But I do want to point out that there is in this an emphasis not on how Hosea feels about this, not on how Gomer feels about this, but as Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory says, it's remarkable that in his treatment, the subject of preoccupation is not the apostate, not the person who's turned away, not the backslider, but God the abandoned. God the abandoned. You forgot me. And Heschel suggests that in some ways, maybe what this piece is trying to do is to create a feeling of emotional solidarity. I'm sure people have a ton of questions, but I'm just going to push through a bit more to finish this first section, chapter 3, just to move on a little bit more, because there's a major question that intersects with the rest of this before we can go back to really puzzling through, did this really happen? Did he have to actually marry her? Are these real children? What's this all about? Because in chapter 3, here, I'll share it in just one moment, we're going to see that there's a similar story told. It's a short chapter, just 5 verses. And what I want to suggest you think about once I start reading, and I'll let you know from the beginning, there's of course a debate, so you get to figure out what you think, is the woman in chapter 3 that is being discussed the same woman in chapter 1 and 2, or is it a different woman entirely? All right, I'll share my screen and we'll get to the bottom of this mystery. Chapter 3, 1 through 5. And again, I'm going to read the altar while you read, while you have the Sepharia JPS. And God said to me, again, go love a woman, beloved by a companion, yet an adulteress, like the love of God for the Israelites when they turned to other gods and to lovers of cups of the grape. And I loved a lusting woman, and I hired her for myself with 15 weights of silver and a homer of barley and a letech of barley. And I said to her, many days you shall dwell with me, you shall not play the whore, and you shall be no man's, and I too shall not come to bed with you. For many days shall the Israelites dwell without king, and without commander, and without sacrifice, and without sacred pillar, and without ephod, and without teraphim. Afterward, the Israelites shall turn back and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall revere the Lord and his bounty in the latter days. So we can see the similarity of the similar instruction, and yet there are differences, and the similarity of the licentious woman who will eventually be faithful, right? But there are major differences as well. So anyone want to weigh in? Is it the same woman? Is Gomer, is this another kind of retelling of the Gomer story? All right. I'm going to share what some other people think. All right. So some of our medieval commentators believe this is a completely different woman, right? That this happened to Hosea twice, right? And in this one, which also asks about his own adultery, by the way, right? But he doesn't sleep with her, we'll notice, right? He says, you know, I'm paying for you to not sleep with anyone. And she's not a licentious woman or a prostitute in the same way. She's an adulterer. Um, but that does, you know, beg the question of the payment. Okay. And one, you know, one commentator even goes so far, the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, to say that each parable is a different part of Jewish history, even. But beyond this question of whether the first woman is the same as the woman in the first chapter is the same as the woman in the third chapter, I want to get into the question of what's going on here? You know, do we really think this is a metaphor, an analogy, or do we really think he married this woman and this happened? And so we've got a whole school of commentators, including the medieval Ibn Ezra and the Radak again, Rabbi David Kimchi, and even the Rambam, who says, of course not. This is only a prophetic vision, right? God said to do this, but it was all on another level of reality. Don't worry. Hosea didn't have to get married. These children didn't have to actually come into the world. It's all a metaphor. But there are plenty of commentators who say, no, actually, like the Abarbanel, he says, look, the prophets are God's agents to straighten out God's people. And therefore, God can command them to do whatever is necessary to achieve this. Goes with the territory. If your job is prophet, you don't get to pick which words come out, and you don't get to pick your own wife, right? God's in charge, not you, the prophet. And the Talmud, which is on your sheet, the Talmud also weighs in. And in Psachim 27a, the Talmud says what it thinks. It says, in God's voice, what shall I do with this old man, meaning Hosea? I will order him, go and marry a harlot and beget thee children of harlotry. And then I will order him, send her away from your presence. And this is what I believe Michael talked about in the chat as well. If he will be able to send her away, so will I too send Israel away. For it is said, and the Lord said unto Hosea, go, take unto thee a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry. And it is written, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. The Talmud is saying, I'm not reporting on whether this actually happened or not. The Talmud is saying, what I care about is that you get the point. And the point is that for God, this is intimate. And I don't know, you know, the Talmud is saying, I'm going to use the most intimate relationships, the relationships of parent and of spouse, to try to communicate to you the pathos, the loneliness, the upset of the divine. I want you to know that the divine cares and the divine is affected just like you would be affected in your own intimate relationships. This is what it's like for God. This is Heschel's idea here of emotional solidarity. And there is, I'm going to go a little quickly here because I see the time and I do want to leave some time for questions. There's a whole section here on Dat Elohim, knowledge of God. We heard that in verse 21 in chapter 2, Ve'eristichli bedat Hashem, and I will betroth you to me with the knowledge of God. But this phrase, Dat Elohim, you'll see on your sheets, it comes up over and over again. I gave you 3 different examples of this idea of knowing God. And Da'at, of course, comes from the root Yada, Yud Dalid Ayin, right? Which is not intellectual knowledge, but it's the same word of experiential knowing, even sexual knowing, right? If we go back to Garden of Eden, in Genesis, right? In chapter 2, verse 17, Ume'etz Hadat, right? The tree of knowledge, right? That's a live and living embodied tree. And then later in chapter 4, verse 1, V'ha'adam yada et Chava, and the man, the Adam knew Eve, right? That's what they're talking about, sexual knowledge there. So knowledge here has an overlay of sexuality and of intimacy and of not just knowing something, but knowing with your body, knowing with yourself. And most importantly, this is what Heschel would say, it actually means caring. It means knowing in such a way that you care, that you feel connected. Heschel again. The relationship between God and Israel, conceived by Hosea in terms of marital love, desertion, and the hope of a new betrothal, calls not only for right action, but also for a feeling for each other on the part of those involved. It implies not only legal obligations, but also inner attitudes, right? How does the prophet tell you not only that you're in the wrong, right? But that God hurts because of that. And you should hurt if you hurt God. You should not want to hurt God. You should want to return and give love. Okay, there's more, and on your sheet, on your source sheet, you'll see that there's a whole section on tshuva. We read Hosea when we on Shabbat tshuva. As we can see, the whole idea of the couple reuniting is based in the idea of tshuva. But I want to open up for some questions or comments. And I haven't been monitoring the chat, but I'll try to look. And if people have questions, why don't you raise your hand on the reaction button? Oh, and here's an easy one for Mia. The alternate translation that I used is Robert Alter's amazing Hebrew Bible. It's in 3 volumes, the Torah, Prophets, and Writings. And it's got, along with a gorgeous translation, a fantastic commentary. Highly, highly recommended. It's a towering achievement. Okay. Do we have any questions, or I'll just start going through the chat? Oh, Heschel isn't on the page, but um, in chapter 14, uh, the chapter 14 verses 3 through 10, that's the Haftorah for Shabbat Tshuva. And there's a lot of beautiful Tshuva language in there, but not only there. Okay.
iPhone.
Yeah.
iPhone.
Go ahead.
Victor from Kansas. So I don't know that I agree with the hurting of God. I agree that we can hurt each other and we're God in the image and all that stuff, but I don't believe that the entity or whatever you want to call it that can be hurt because I see in all these prophecies nothing but hope. I never see doom. I really don't. Even because he's saying, here's what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. So if you were smart, you can avoid that. In reality, that's how I see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. And that's more than allowed. What we're trying to do is look at what Hosea presents, and we then use commentators to try to just deepen our understanding of Hosea. So thank you for adding your own.
Yael?
Thank you. It seems to me, and it's actually inherent in Hosea's name, that he reaches down for those who are the most lost. He reaches down and he not only takes this woman, but he marries her. He bonds to her. And also the names of their children, because she is so lost, her progeny are an outcome of that. And so he's bonded his life, and that's where salvation comes from. And I think we can almost use this as a prescription for saving our own selves. We reach down into the most wounded part or the most lost part of ourselves, and we embrace it with the other godly part of ourselves, and we bond and we make a commitment to raise it up.
Beautiful, right? The first three chapters are all about a relationship, and I see a lot in just a quick scan of the chat of people saying, God doesn't have emotions. God can't be in a relationship. This isn't my idea of God. And I want to say two things about that. One, of course, that's fine. Two, Maimonides would agree with you 100%. Maimonides says the only thing we can say about God, is what we don't know, right? God is not this, because anything that we can imagine, it's already bounded by our ability to understand as humans, right? So of course we can't speak for God. But when we're looking at a prophet, at least in the classes that I'm teaching, what we're looking at is how is God using this prophet to get a message across? And if you want to say that God doesn't have emotions and God, isn't in relationships, that's totally fine, but that's not the God of the Torah, right? The God of the Torah is a character who feels things, who cares, who is deeply invested in God's relationship with this people, right? Now, what that actually means in theology and philosophy, that's totally up for grabs, right? But as a character in this literature, God cares, right? Especially in the books of prophets. If God didn't care, God, to use Hosea's own metaphor, God would have left. God would have left the relationship. All right, I see another hand up. We'll give you the last word. Go ahead.
Just in response to Rambam, I would say God cannot not be in relationship. It is God's nature to be in relationship.
Yes, that seems to be what we hear from the Torah. Again, it gets difficult when we try to say anything categorical about God, qua God. But what we can do, what I feel totally empowered to do, is to talk about God as God appears, right, in these stories. And clearly for Hosea, there is an idea that God wants to be in relationship, and not just in any relationship, but a truly, not just a master-slave relationship, not just a you do whatever I say relationship, but a love relationship where I love you and you love me, right? And this language comes back, right? It's the exact opposite of what we saw of the third son, lo ami. We see, I will be your God and you will be my people. That is the relationship. And as the rabbi commented in the chat, that is exactly what we act out in an embodied way with the tefillin straps. When we put on our tefillin, we say, I will be in relationship with you. I will be bound to you. And the implication, of course, which is wild and impossible, is that God is bound to us. And of course, the rabbis of the Talmud imagined God wrapping God's own tefillin, right? In the mutual love relationship. All right, I'm happy to take Morton's question or comment, but I know that we're at time, so
that's fine.
I'll leave it to Julie.
Morton, go ahead.
I think we lost him.
Morton? Go ahead and unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay. I thought the whole purpose was that Hashem asked him now to leave and desert his wife and children. And he found it hard to do. And when he didn't do it, that's when God explained that that Hashem's betrothed was the Israeli people, and that he wanted him to learn the lesson that way. Am I mixing up the story?
No, you're right. God is saying basically, I'm using this as a learning tool. You think it's so easy for me to send this people away, but you try sending your kids away just because, or your wife away. You can't do it, and neither can I. You don't want to do it, and neither do I. Thanks.